Liquid nitrogen gas, or LNG as it's more commonly known, has, since the fracking boom, become a major source of energy around the world. In particular, the US has prominently been shipping LNG across the globe, almost all of which is leaving through the Gulf Coast. This has meant new infrastructure, sites of extraction, and environmental risks for those living along the coast. Today on Gulf Streams, we're talking all about LNG and how it's changing our region. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and associate director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and the associate director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today we're sitting down with Naomi Yoder, a data scientist at Texas Southern University, and James Hiatt, the founder of For a Better Bayou. And we're talking all about the growing LNG infrastructure around the region. James Hiatt, Naomi Yoder, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
James, Naomi, would you mind just taking a minute here just to first off introduce yourselves to our listeners and tell them a little about the work that you do?
My name is James Hiatt, and I'm from Southwest Louisiana in Lake Charles. I was born and raised here. My grandfather worked on pipelines, gas pipelines, retired from that. My father worked at a refinery and retired from that, and I ended up working at a refinery before I ended up getting into this work. And now I'm the director of For Better Bayou, a nonprofit organization based in community that's we've seen so many of these storms. A storm came ashore just last night in Florida. The climate impacts and the connection between what we already have here in Louisiana and along the Texas coast of these fossil fuel infrastructure and the build out of even more that is being planned, these LNGs, and so we are grounded in community and wanting to shift away from the things that harm us and cause suffering to our neighbors and ourselves, and move into a transition into a nourishing type of economy.
Yeah. So I'm Naomi Yoder. I am an environmental scientist, and I come to this work through research and policy and in a kind of technical supporting role. I think of myself as a science communicator, but that's not my title. So I work now for the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at Texas Southern University, where I'm in a research staff position. And the Bullard Center was launched to address longstanding issues of systematic inequality and structural racism that cause disproportionate pain, suffering, and death in Black and other people of color communities. So all of our work is kind of supporting communities and essentially translating some of the technical science into, what that means for people's lives and justice on the ground. So my involvement with LNG has been for several years now, where I've been studying and mapping and um, talking about the LNG terminals especially on the Gulf Coast, and working in advocacy spaces around that.
Awesome. So jumping right in, we're talking about LNG today with our two LNG experts. So what is liquid natural gas in general? It seems like a bit of an oxymoron, a fuel source that is both a liquid and a gas. What distinguishes it from regular natural gas?
Yeah, well, so I'll try it that one. So liquefied natural gas. So natural gas is a misnomer. It's fossil gas. It's fracked gas. It's called natural because that sounds better to the industry. So I'll refer to it as liquefied fossil gas. But it's fossil gas or natural gas is methane primarily. There's other gases in there, but gas that comes to your stove if you have a gas stove is the same thing. That's methane gas. And liquefying it, there's really only one reason to do that. It's liquefied. There are two ways you could do that, through temperature or pressure. And in this case, it's frozen, it's temperature liquefied. And so the gas is sent through massive turbines that pump refrigerants through the methane gas, and that reduces it down in volume to what is it, about a 1/600th of its size, something like that. And the reason to do this, like I was saying, the only reason is for transportation, to transport the gas. It doesn't make sense to ship a tanker full of raw gas when you could, transport more efficiently, 600 times that as liquefied gas. So the very reason for existence for LNG is essentially overseas trade of gas. And so I think that's one thing that's really important in this discussion, is that, all of the massive export terminals are export. They're for international trade and essentially overseas shipping. So there's also trade-offs around all of this stuff, but that's essentially the reasoning behind it. And there's a lot of discussion around why liquefied gas might be better than something else, but essentially it's a fossil fuel. That's the basic fact is still there, that it's the same methane gas as we might use from a pipeline on land.
Yeah, thank you. So is this I feel like I've heard a lot about liquid natural gas in the news recently. Is this a new technology? When did liquefying natural gas for export sort of come onto the scene?
I can take a stab at that one. So the very first liquefied natural gas shipment was in the 50s, was actually from Lake Charles, Louisiana. But it did not really, take off here. In Lake Charles, we've had an import facility for LNG since 1980. There used to be two import facilities. One was in Boston, one was in Lake Charles. In the early 2000s, in order to secure our national security, to make sure we had enough energy, two more facilities were built in Southwest Louisiana, Cameron LNG and Sabine Pass. LNG were built for import in order to secure our national security and energy needs. What happened was in about 2009, 2010, we began fracking in the Permian Basin. America began injecting millions and millions of gallons of fresh water into these shale, and it would hydraulically fracture the rock, and it release oil and gas. And so all of a sudden, we no longer need to import any more gas because we have a surplus caused by fracking. That's the main point that needs to be understood. Is this is not a conventional well. As we usually you find a reservoir of oil or gas, and you drill down into it, and then you can extract it like that. That is not the way that the gas is being produced today. It's being produced by fracking, and so because of that surplus, that gave rise to a need to export the gas, because they were producing more gas than domestically was being consumed, and also. There's a huge profit margin in this difference between the gas prices here locally, domestically, and the gas prices in Asia. Initially, most of this gas was destined for Asia up until Russia invaded Ukraine. And now we see that a lot of this gas is being sent over to Europe. So that is the heart of it. Like what made this boom happen was fracking and the ability and profit margins, the profit taking of companies. I think it's important for folks to really understand, because we've all been seeing our buses, our trash trucks all have clean burning natural gas, is what it'll say. And that may be true. You know, the actual endpoint burning is probably better than other fossil fuels. But when you take into account what it takes to extract from the ground by fracking, all of the compressor stations, the pipeline, the methane leaks that occur all along the supply chain, all the way to these export terminals, which are energy intensive. It takes a lot of energy to freeze gas to minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not there's not a low cost way of doing that. So it's energy intensive. Each one of these terminals, there's currently 5 along the Gulf Coast that are operating as export terminals, with several others under construction, and 2 other ones on the East Coast there. What we see is that the natural gas, this fossil gas, fracked gas, methane, extracted from underground, pumped all the way across the state of Texas to the Gulf Coast, where it's frozen for export. That takes the domestic supply out of the hands of the American consumers. And so what we've seen is that there's a disparate impact, and such a the amount of price people are paying for their electricity, especially in Louisiana. Unfortunately, we're not like Texas. We don't have a large portfolio of other options. 75% of electricity in Louisiana is generated by natural gas. And so when we take that gas and send it to the highest bidder overseas, it drives up the domestic price. So people are paying more and more for gas, and they're also suffering the pollution impacts and the climate impacts of continued dependency on fossil fuels. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what flavor of the carbon is that we take from underground. If it's coal, if it's oil, if it's gas, we are taking carbon from underground, burning it, and adding it to the atmosphere, and that is what is causing climate change. That dependency on the extraction of carbon is causing climate change, and the increase in storms and drought and wildfires and floods and the chaos that we see all around us all the time. And what, even knowing that, even listening to the climate scientists and just the own industries, Exxon had a study in the 70s that showed that fossil fuel dependency is driving climate change. Knowing that, we still see industry players in the government continuing to double down on what is causing suffering for so many, for a wider audience even now. And I'll just make one more point about this. From the time we began using fossil fuels, fence line and frontline communities, people who live alongside, my mama's from Kentucky, she grew up in front of a coal mine. There has been suffering associated with that from the time we started extracting and burning, and that has never been reconciled or even addressed. And so that's why we have places like in Louisiana called Cancer Alley, why people I know have had premature death and suffering of health impacts because of our dependency on fossil fuels. And the only reason we have a large boom in this LNG build out is profits for a few companies on the backs of literally every single person and living thing on this planet. And it's just ridiculous to think that we can continue knowing better. We should act better, and instead the profit motive is so strong that it blinds people to the reality of the suffering that is accompanying our dependency.
Yeah, I wanna add one thing about the geopolitical stage, which is that all of that is on point. And if, in case you're not convinced that this is like, kind of a greed-driven, profit-driven endeavor, in until 2015, the U.S. did not have any LNG export facilities. So that, and essentially all of the facilities, like James said, that were existing were import. And then that turned on its head, and export became, a big thing where, Qatar and a couple of other places were already exporting a lot of LNG to mostly Japan and some to China and some other countries. But so in after 2015 and this kind of massive shift, you know, the US started to, and essentially, you know, the people that wanted to make money off of this situation started to get in place. And of course, as we've seen with every other, you know, petrochemical industry in the US, the target is, you know, Black and brown and poor communities on the Gulf Coast for those pieces of infrastructure, for the most polluting pieces of that. There is also a lot of pollution that's very damaging that comes from the extraction of and fracking of gas. So, but anyway, there's an incredible impact throughout this life cycle. But this all started, you know, a kind of turning on a dime. And as of 2022, the United States overtook Qatar and any other country as being the largest exporter of LNG. I've heard from industry analysts that Calcasieu and Cameron Parish, the two parishes in Southwest Louisiana, where the largest number of terminals is set to be located and is already located. There's three in Cameron Parish right now. But with that build out, if that were to be complete, Calcasieu and Cameron Parish would export more than any other country on Earth. So it falls directly in line with the environmental racism of the petrochemical industry that's, you know, been in place and enforced since, you know, before Spindletop, but around that time.
Can we just drill a little bit into, sorry for the pun. You know, you've mentioned, you know, pollution and some of these effects, and especially certainly the environmental justice aspect of who it affects the most. But what are, you know, you say pollution, like what are we actually talking about? What's coming out here? What are some of those health ramifications? What are some of the impacts for these communities beyond, you know, just having export facilities? Because clearly there are consequences here, but what do those actually look like?
Yeah, there are a whole host of health effects, and so there's the direct pollution from an export terminal, which is kind of a monumental amount of pollution that comes out of that. Plus, there's, as James mentioned, the greenhouse gases that come from that. So one LNG export terminal uses the power of a small city. It's
Hmm.
enormous. It's enormous. So the contribution to climate change also, as you know, and your listeners probably know, affects Black and brown people and poor people first and worst. So there's the climate change health component that is massive. Then alongside that, we have the terminals themselves emitting particulate matter, NOx or nitrous oxides, which are a precursor to ozone, plus volatile organic compounds, also the precursor to ozone. So we have this kind of concoction of air pollutants that you know, doesn't do us any favors, especially in, you know, the Houston, Galveston, Brazoria area, which we're in a severe non-attainment right now for ozone. Plus the other industries that are located on the Gulf Coast, where the LNG terminals also are co-located, are compounding that whole thing. The other terminals and facilities also emit many of those similar or same hazardous chemicals and pollutants. And so we have, you know, a massive cumulative impact effect added to the mix. So there's also, I should say, water pollution and wetlands loss that are very significant issues associated with LNG terminals and pipelines. But so some of the health effects from those air pollutants, just the air pollutants that I mentioned, and this isn't, climate change, this isn't wetlands loss. There's so many others that I want to be able to mention, but we really don't have time. Like that's the bottom line is that I don't have time to say them all. But some of the health effects of those air pollutants are asthma, COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, strokes, heart disease, reproductive issues. There's mental health components. There's just essentially a myriad of diseases and ailments that are either debilitating or fatal. And so, that, like I said, with the compounding as well of cumulative effects and historical pollution, pressure, and burden, we see just a massive impact from these LNG terminals.
These, I know we talked about the LNG terminals in Louisiana, those where there's, they're exporting more than, or potentially exporting more than any country. So is this sort of, are these plants or export terminals being built all along the Gulf Coast? Are there areas that are more concentrated? Where are these facilities being built?
It's being really concentrated here along the Texas and Louisiana border. We already have 3 operating facilities here. There's already permits in place for 6 others right across the Sabine River in Port Arthur. There's 2 terminals under construction right now. There's Freeport LNG in Brazoria County. In Corpus Christi, they have a facility, and in Brownsville, there are 2 facilities that are currently undergoing litigation at FERC, but were permitted in Brownsville. There's one south of New Orleans that is under construction, almost complete. They may actually today or in the next week be loading their first cargo. And then there's some floating LNGs. These ideas of these ships that will do the operations of a plant of one of these onshore facilities that'll take place out in the Gulf. So I think there's almost 24, 21, 22 facilities that are planned. Some of them were permitted, and up until the beginning of this year, some of the ones that are in Southwest Louisiana have had their permits in place for almost 10 years, since about 2015, 2016, and there was no market force driving them to be built, because the truth is there's no real need for all of these. And so what we then, it was paused because of the Department of Energy took a pause on granting these export licenses that allows companies to sell this gas to non-free trade agreement countries. This is getting a little wonky, so forgive me, but they stopped that because we have been advocating that you're putting these things in places that are already overburdened communities, already suffering from climate change, and it's affecting the economics of so many people and American manufacturing even. And so maybe we should stop, instead of just rubber stamping everything that comes across the desk, and if it's in the public interest, which is the technical legal term for it. And it's very clear to me. I invite anybody to come down to Cameron Parish anytime and take a good look at what this economic prosperity that has been promised looks like, because it's not there. What you'll see is a community that's hanging on. The folks who live down in southern Cameron, in the town of Cameron, are mostly fishermen. Everybody else has really moved north because of the storms, and also because you cannot afford the insurance. $16,000 a year premiums is what people are being asked to pay. And what we've seen in Louisiana, and this is true in Texas too, is that these companies come in and they don't have, they are granted these huge, absolutely mind-blowing tax exemptions. In the parish of Cameron, where there's about 4,000 people living, the amount of taxes that are exempted every year is almost $1 billion a year, in a place that could use that money for coastal restoration and protection, and to pay the teachers, and the hospital that was devastated in hurricane could actually get rebuilt, and all these kind of things is also happening in Texas, where huge, absolutely huge tax abatements are given away to companies that are making billions of dollars. They could definitely afford to pay their taxes, their fair share, and actually benefit the local community. But they don't benefit the local community. Instead, what they do is they flare all night and day. They release black smoke and flames, and the things you can't see is more concerning. Like Naomi was speaking about, these NOx and particulate matter, which drives respiratory illness and asthma and cardiovascular disease. These kind of things are being put upon people who have in Cameron for sure have lived there for generations, living off the land, fishing, shrimping, and now they live alongside this huge, massive polluting industry that benefits them in no way whatsoever. And they also live under, this is not a scare tactic, but the blast radius of one of these actually losing containment and exploding is miles wide. And so that is a piece that these my friends and family are living alongside this constant worry about what is this alarm that I'm hearing over there? Is something bad about to happen? On top of having to suffer the health impacts of these things. And one more point too, just so we tie it all together, is that the fracking is for me is so widespread, going on not just here but in Western Pennsylvania too. They're fracking for export, and what we found is that children who grow up alongside frac sites are 2 to 3 times more likely to get leukemia. No one should be having to suffer a premature death. We all have this one life on this earth, however long we get to be here. This gift of life that is for us is being taken and shortened for some folks, especially low income and BIPOC communities, and that is for the profit of so few, for the profit of corporations and companies from elsewhere that don't benefit the people at all. I think that point is without the fracking, without the exports, there would be a reduction in fracking. Without the fracking, there wouldn't be any exports. It's really a tied together kind of thing. There's an intersection here where the suffering seems to get wider and wider, and the benefits don't go anywhere. I'm not sure you can pay somebody enough money to have their life lessened, to not be able to enjoy the full breadth and depth of this incredible miracle of life that we all have.
I want to just grab onto something you were talking about there, James, with the fact that they're, regardless of whether these things are, not to fearmonger in any way, explosive, yes, of course, liquid natural gas, concerning if there's an explosion. I think a more definitive concern that folks have, not just around the security of these, but is the reality that we're talking about the Gulf Coast, which I think listeners are familiar with as a pretty hurricane-prone area. We are not strangers to natural disasters in this part of the country. And so I think a real concern that a lot of people have is just around what is the kind of infrastructural security that's going into the construction of these sites. What are the concerns, not just explosions, but thinking about, flooding and the kind of risks that we have around places that are close to large bodies of water that are known to flood. And as Naomi was pointing to earlier, certainly there's a climatological kind of argument to be made around the burning of fossil fuels, but even more directly, as you were talking about with marshland and wetland, right? The statistic that I've grown up with, growing up in Louisiana, was a football field of land every hour melts off the coast of Louisiana. That we've been using that quote since the 80s, since before I was born. We've used it through the time I was a kid. But even more to the point is a driving cause, certainly not the only cause. I'm not going to solely put the blame on oil and gas pipelines, but one of the causes of that is the completion of oil and gas pipelines off the coast of Louisiana. And so I'm just wondering about, how does this factor into both the compounding of natural disasters in terms of literally lessening resilience, but then what happens if one of these terminals gets hit by a hurricane or a flood? And what is the kind of protection that's required to build these in places we already know are very vulnerable?
I can say that we had Hurricane Laura in 2020 here in Southwest Louisiana, and this facility right on the coast, Venture Global's Calcasieu Pass, they have 20 plus foot, I think it's 27-foot walls around the facility. And so what we saw after that storm was, and it's also built on the natural drainage of that of the west side of the river there, is that the facility was okay. They weren't completed building, but they did not have flooding. But what we saw was that the folks who have already built their houses up 18 feet because of previous storms flooded. And what we saw was that it took days and days for that water to recede because the natural drainage was blocked off by these 27-foot walls where they built the facility. So I can say from that perspective that they are fine building security for themselves at the risk of the community. In Southwest Louisiana, we don't have a levee system built up like they do in Southeast Louisiana, and so the marsh and the wetlands are our security system. It is the buffer that takes the hit from these storms, and we're destroying that. It's already being destroyed and has been for decades now, and the mitigation and the any kind of like coastal protection is not there in Southwest Louisiana. And so Cameron LNG, I think Naomi maybe can speak to that. They went up in a helicopter, I think, after that. And these facilities are flaring and releasing everything they can because there's a loophole in the EPA, the startup, shutdown, and maintenance loophole. So when there's a natural disaster, they basically have a free license to burn everything and anything you want. They won't count against your permit, and you won't be accountable to pay for those harms that's ongoing. So they're good. And also, I don't know if you can actually ever really out-engineer Mother Nature. We see these storms getting stronger and stronger and more frequent, and we've seen other facilities, especially around New Orleans, that have flooded and flooded and flooded. And one refinery in Belchase there, they finally just shut down because I think after Ida, it's like, how many times are we going to keep doing this? So anyway, I'll stop there.
No, no, I grew up in New Orleans, so I'm feeling all of the pain you're talking about. And then here in Houston, yeah, between Beryl and the derecho earlier this season, I think everyone is feeling the strength of what are no longer even what we would think of as particularly intense storms, and just how impactful they are. I'll also say, as a southeastern Louisianian, we envy you those marshes and wetlands that you're using as those levees are questionable, and our wetlands and marshes have been gone for a while. and
Yeah,
yeah,
and I
terrified that
wanted,
yours are going to.
well, yeah, so Cameron Parish is the second, is the next parish that has the most land loss after Plaquemines Parish.
Yeah.
And Plaquemines Parish has lost 50% of its land since what, 75 or
Yeah.
50 maybe. Anyway, it's incredible. There's not the football field of land, melting away every hour is not a uniform, right? There are places where it's worse, and Cameron Parish and Plaquemines Parish where there are LNG terminals, either operating or about to, are exactly where that's happening. So we've also, I wanted to say that we have asked repeatedly to all of the agencies, to FERC and to the Pipelines Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, for plans around the risk assessment plans that a facility would have to prepare ahead of time before operating, and which only makes sense. You should have a plan in place before you put something like this in what General Honore has called Hurricane Alley of Southwest
Mm.
Louisiana. So we are not allowed to see those. They are trade secrets, essentially. And we've been told that if we were to look at them, we would know how they were built, and that's illegal. There's also been the reason given to us that it's a national security issue. If you're able to see it, then someone else with bad intentions would also be able to see it. So there's excuse after excuse is really what it comes down to. And that means that the public and then people that live at the fence line of these facilities don't get the information about what they're at risk of. And not to get too wonky again as well, but there's also a loophole in our right to know laws, which the EPA oversees, where facilities that store large quantities of chemicals like LNG are required to submit a response management plan. I'm sorry, a risk management plan, which is essentially a worst case scenario plan of what happens if those chemicals explode. And LNG terminals are exempted from risk management plans. And it's a long story, but it's a huge problem. That's essentially why we don't have this information of what is the worst case scenario. We do know that there's a likelihood, right? We've seen this from many other disasters, like the Arkema fire in after Harvey, right? There was we see these the weather disaster comes in, and floods, or there's also wind. There can be other forces that damage equipment, or like James was saying, they're flaring anyway because that's what they do during a shutdown. And suddenly, there's another tank that explodes because one tank is on fire or something happened. And I'd also like to say that there's a huge issue with all of this in terms of worker safety and evacuation of the communities that are around the facilities. And this is, we live in these coastal areas. There's often, they're very rural. So if you're trying to get out and the LNG terminal is sort of in your way, or there's any problem with their emergency management plan, you don't have any options. And we saw some serious problems in the emergency management plan for Freeport LNG after the explosion in 2022. So we don't have the information that we should have, and that's just basic common sense that we should be able to tell the neighbors that live next to these things what kind of danger you're facing.
If I could just jump in here too, just one story about what happened last year in June, on a day where we had some rain and some lightning. Down in Cameron, they're still operating on temporary generators. The entire grid is being run on a temporary generator that that caught fire. It was actually they've been trucking over liquefied natural gas from the middle of Texas to this temporary generating unit, and that caught fire, which is on the east side of town. To the west of town is the river that is only served by a ferry. And unfortunately, this is one of the point is that the emergency planning is not in place, and like it should be. The ferry did not have electricity, and so it could not lower the gate, and so the people in Cameron were stuck between an inoperable ferry and a huge fire, and basically with no power in the middle of June, and you know how hot and humid it can be, so they had to sit outside under the trees, and it was hours before they were able to get out of there, and that was just on the side. That's not this terminal and these other issues. So we already know that the emergency planning is not in place and not sufficient just for a regular well, I guess a regular accident, which I don't know if there is such a thing, but much less what would be happening when something even more catastrophic happens. How can we guarantee the safety of our people and our communities when we're not even allowed to know if they have an adequate plan at all, or if it's even operational, like we saw this one obviously was not. So there's so much risk involved, and we do live in these storm-prone areas.
Yeah, thank you. This is definitely a very complicated and high impact issue of environmental injustice and sort of bringing everything together. What do you think the future of LNG is on the Gulf Coast, regardless of what it should be, you know? And, should we expect to see a lot more of these facilities being built? It sounds like there's a lot in the works. Um, and so what would you say is the general state of LNG right now, and what is the trajectory of where we're going?
I think what we see is that there's already enough built. We already are able to satisfy whatever of our needs, our partners' needs in Europe are, and in Asia. Just with the ones that are already built, there's three more under construction that will even add more to that. So what I think is if they do continue to build more of these, is that there will have a lot of abandoned LNG facilities in 20 or 30 years when they're no longer necessary, or additionally, when they're underwater. Cameron Parish is by 2050 expected to be 1 to 2 feet underwater, which leaves only the roadway, and that is just what we already have going without adding more and more to it. So I do think that a couple more are going to be built. We are going to actively continue to help people understand how this is not in our public interest. It's not in any of our interests, and it's definitely not it's not for America or America first, or this is like America last, like the profiteers first and the people last. If there was some economic benefit to this, we would have seen it. If there was some prosperity to it, we would have seen it. We have three of them here in Southwest Louisiana, and again, I invite anybody to come take a good look at because this is what the industry promotes, and it keeps saying is that it's for jobs. There's all these jobs, and I saw Ted Cruz mention 7,000 jobs. There are no 7,000 jobs involved in this. There's thousands of construction jobs that many of them are go to imported labor, and go to other people from other. It's not locals that are receiving these jobs is the main point. And in the long term, there's no benefit for any community at all. They take the brunt of the suffering because of this, and these companies, meanwhile, are making enough money to buy high-powered lobbyists in Washington to keep pushing for a continued extractive economy instead of reading the writing on the wall and moving towards what is sustainable and what is actually necessary for our communities to continue to be and much less thrive. I think there's opportunities here for thriving communities, but it doesn't come at the hands of more of these export terminals.
I think that it's impossible to predict, what might happen. We also can't escape the fact that we live in a system of, oppression and inequity. And so that as those systems are entrenched and continue, the problems and the suffering and the injustice will also continue. But I do think that we have choices, and we can say there are enough of these terminals. I think it's also, I forgot to mention that all of the 5 operating terminals right now have expansion plans. Plus some of the ones that are under construction, they also have an expansion plan after they already get constructed, right? So it's sort of like there's never an end to, what the the corporations and the people in power and that stand to make a profit from these things have in mind. It's that we have the opportunity to say no and to change some of the systems of power around our local communities, and then hopefully, up to a planetary level, right? So I think I feel hopeful because I do think that um, we are shifting. Things are shifting. We have more attention to environmental justice as an issue within the past 4 years than since 1980. So that's that's not to say that things change overnight, but it is to say that there's awareness, and where that's the first step, right? That's always the first step in changing the system is becoming aware. So, as we continue, um, we hope that there will just be more and more ability to step out of those systems that have kind of created this issue and this problem, and where we can all, live together without the profit motive and without having to, build facilities on top of other people and at the expense of the most vulnerable.
I should have mentioned too that Greenpeace and Sierra Club came out with a report here just recently called "Permit to Kill," that basically describes the premature deaths and the health costs associated with the ones that already exist. And Harris County is home to one of the largest parts of that. Like, you think that the pollution stays, only on the fence line, but the truth is it doesn't, and using the EPA's Cobra tool, they were able to show that Dallas County and Harris, these heavily populated centers in Texas are directly connected to these LNGs.
Yeah, and we didn't talk that much either about pipelines, which are such a huge piece of this and are an incredible impact on, people and communities and the land and the water. So there's just like there's so many tentacles of impact, and you know it's it's hard to talk about any one place because while we do want to talk about that, they're all critically important, and at the same time, Southwest Louisiana and the Eastern Texas that is the epicenter of this LNG terminal build out. That's where, the Gulf Coast is the epicenter of the American build out, and of that, it's those two parishes in Jefferson County.
No, and we could absolutely keep talking about these really important issues. Unfortunately, this is the end of the time that we have today. But I really want to thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise and your knowledge about this topic. Naomi Yoder is a data scientist at Texas Southern University, and James Hiatt is the president of For a Better Bayou. James, Naomi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great.
Thank you.
Well,
I
thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much. Yeah, appreciate you.
We'll now go to our researcher, Jaden Bray Boyce, who has an update on how you can get involved around Houston this week.
Hey y'all, it's officially October, which means hopefully we'll be experiencing cooler weather soon that will make you want to get outside and give back to the community. Next week, consider giving some of your time to help out one of these incredible organizations. On October 12th from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m., West Houston Assistance Ministries is looking for 10 to 15 individuals to help pack and give away boxes of food. Tasks may include separating, stocking, and distributing to the first 250 cars that arrive. Since the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, upwards of 54 million people have suffered from food insecurity. By volunteering on the 12th, you're doing your part to help reduce food insecurity in Houston. If this is something you're interested in, please go to volunteerhouston.org, click on the 12th, and register for this event. Please make sure you are 18 years or older before you register. Also, make sure to wear comfortable and weather-appropriate clothes, as this is an outdoor event, and make sure you're able to lift potentially very heavy boxes of food. The other volunteering opportunity in Houston is also on the 12th, and I think this might be the perfect opportunity for some of you, as you'd be helping with various tasks on a farm. From 9 a.m. to noon, find yourself at Shamba Ya Amani. This farm of peace is working for justice by feeding our community both by body and soul. This farm feeds the body by growing vegetables and fruit trees, raising bees, and tending to the flowers that sustain the bees. Perhaps even more important is that they feed the soul by building this farm as a community, forming connection with all of those involved and the land that you're working with. If this opportunity is calling your name, consider signing up at volunteerhouston.org. Click the 12th and sign up. Any additional information you may need will be provided upon signing up. Be sure that if you go, to bring a water bottle, long pants, and closed-toed shoes or boots. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and happy volunteering.
Up next time on Gulfstreams, we'll be talking with local advocates about walkability in Houston and how it affects our greater environment. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulfstreams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulfstreams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulfstreams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce, Neman Rinsdorf, and Sophia Soltes. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.